Thank goodness Tim's here because I'm speechless. Thank you, Tim. So good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce to you today poet, writer, critic, VIU Professor Emeritus, and my friend and colleague, Dr. Timothy Brownlow. When I began graduate school in the mid-'80s, I met someone who's now a good friend who, when we were getting to know each other, he persuaded me to put down what he called the rubbish I was reading and implored me to get into Irish literature. He said, with some feeling I might add, that he wished he had been born Irish. It wasn't very long before I understood the wisdom of his recommendation, and I soon found myself consuming all forms of Irish writing. I remember being astonished at how many great writers I didn't realize were Irish that this little island produced through the centuries. Jonathan Swift, Lawrence Sterne, Oliver Goldsmith, Maria Edgeworth, Richard Sheridan, Oscar Wilde, Bram Stoker, George Bernard Shaw, John Millington Synge, William Butler Yeats, Sean O'Casey, James Joyce, Samuel Beckett, Patrick Kavanagh, Emma Donoghue, C.S. Lewis, Edna O'Brien, Maeve Binchy, and Seamus Heaney himself. This is just to name a few. 4 of these won the Nobel Prize in Literature: Yeats, Shaw, Beckett, and Heaney. When I took up this reading, one of the things I rejoiced in about Irish writers was their downright unpretentiousness and their self-deprecating humor. This bred a fertile milieu highly favorable to satire, especially through the device of comic deflation. This was manifest not only in the works, but in the biographical lives of the artists. For example, when a young man came up to Joyce on the street and asked, "May I kiss the hand that wrote Ulysses?" Joyce replied, "No, it did a lot of other things too." And then there was the famous meeting between Joyce and Proust in Paris. Joyce arrived at Proust's apartment drunk and poorly dressed. They sat next to each other in big chairs, surrounded by supplicants anxiously waiting to record for posterity this conversation of literary giants, only to hear mundane mutterings about the weather and the various bodily complaints of these two geniuses. And then there's Yeats, who looms large over the early stages of Heaney's career, as Tim's talk will mention. How was the aspiring young Joyce to make his way through and around this colossus of Irish literature? Well, in a chance meeting between the two on a Dublin street, Joyce unrelentingly berated Yeats for adulterating his works with politics and folklore, ghosts and goblins. After Yeats proffered a long and spirited defense of his system, the teenage Joyce merely noted Yeats' age and said, "I have met you too late, you are too old." Now, I don't want to suggest that I had a somewhat similar thought when I came to Malaspina and first met Tim, so I won't. But you must imagine my delight to discover a real live Irishman in the English department, one no less who actually knew Seamus Heaney and who remembered seeing in person Samuel Beckett walking his nephew to school. Tim and I immediately struck up a friendship, and through long conversations, usually after church, when we had consumed some of our Lord's tears, Tim significantly extended my education on Irish, but as we now know, really English literature. I've always admired Tim's passion for the arts and his quiet nationalism when it came to all things Irish. He is one of the more literate people I know, and someone who is ardently devoted to the life of the mind. Tim has been remarkably active since retiring sometime in the last century. He has delivered seminars in Dublin in Canada, has taught a course on Shakespeare to a small group of devotees in his local community, regularly teaches through Elder College. His students have always appreciated his enthusiasm for literature. One has written that the gift that he brings to his students comes from what Plato calls the poetic soul. He has the ability to lecture for 3 hours, but not today, I promise, without losing his students. The student continues, he cultivates an environment that brings out the best in each person. I've learned that voices can be beautiful on their own and in a chorus. I've learned that there is still beauty in the world and we can find it. Among his many works, Tim has produced probably the best study of John Clare yet written, and his book of sonnets, Climbing Crow Patrick, is, in my opinion, a masterpiece. Tim continues to write and publish. He has organized and guided a tour through Ireland. He has been recognized in the Alumni Achievement Display Room, St. Columba's College in County Dublin, by a framed handwritten copy of his sonnet, This is a Letter, Mater Dulcissima, to You. And he has collaborated with the international known Irish sculptor Michael Warren, with extracts from Tim's writing appearing in two of Warren's exhibitions, one in Cork and the other in Dublin. In 2007, the journal Poetry Ireland Review published an article about Tim's writing and career titled How Now, Brownlow. An article in the Irish Times in 2006 offered a retrospective assessment of the Dublin magazine under the joint editorship of Tim and Rivers Carew, wherein the author maintained that the magazine's main achievement was to have helped promote and launch some outstanding writers, including Brendan Kennelly, Yvonne Boland, Derek Mann, Michael Longley, and Seamus Heaney. Nobel laureate Seamus Heaney himself, in a personal letter to Tim, had this to say about Climbing Crow Patrick. The book is a generous and true account of the growth of the poet's mind, and I like the way the preoccupations of the maker and the intimacies of the domestic creature are looped and lapped together. There's a great tendresse, many doors. I like that door poem, leading in and out and off, a certain abondante feel all through. I was very touched to get your letter and the poems, and should have responded long ago. Blame the delayed acoustics on this side, the USA, and enjoy your own Tide Stooks. Best wishes to you and for the work, Seamus. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Timothy Brownlow.
Thank you, Ross. I'm glad there weren't the usual Ross jokes. Well, some of them. So I'd like to thank some people. Thank you, Ross McKay, for that excellent introduction. Thank you, Catherine Rollwagon, who is chair of the Colloquium Committee, and her assistants, Melissa Stevens, Sasha Kerbler gave me help with the slides, Jen McGarrigle, Gordon Hack, and of course, thank you, Katarina Wright and Helen Brown. I don't know if they're here today, for founding this excellent series. And welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming on this relatively mild morning. I was scared it was going to snow. So I look forward to leading you through what turns out to be many decades. I'd ask you to use your historical imagination because, as Ross has gently pointed out, I'm pretty ancient. And as an example of that, at the moment I am using FaceTime, which is a form of Skype, as you know, to communicate with my, is it grandniece or great-niece in the UK. And I just worked out the other day that I'm actually 60 years older than her. However, we get on fine. She's now 16, so you can work that out. And if I worked out that if I had been fortunate enough to have a great-whatever uncle when I was 16, he would have to have been born in 1881. So, all systems go, right. May 1966, huge cumulus clouds sailed over the foothills of the Dublin Mountains, their shadows moving across the cricket pitch where I was coaching in the nets. I was an assistant master at a boarding school and also co-editor of a literary quarterly. David Fitzgerald, an esteemed colleague, was approaching down the slope, a smile on his face. I had asked him to review a new volume of poetry for our journal. His smile acknowledged the beautiful weather, but I noticed the slim volume under his arm. I like this greatly. In fact, I sense a touch of spring in the air. So the smile was about inner weather as well. Listen to this. And he read from the title poem of the volume, which describes frogs invading a flax dam. The slap and plop were obscene threats. Some sat poised like mud grenades, their blunt heads farting. We discussed this as not just a bit of choc the bourgeois, épaté le bourgeois 60s language, but much more. Even then, we recognized an unusual sureness of touch, an unerring instinct for the absolutely right word, an almost lazily accomplished ability to set a scene immediately and memorably, the ease at coining an iambic pentameter line that sounded different from the generality of English or Irish poetry. The volume was Death of a Naturalist, published by Faber and Faber, Seamus Heaney's first collection. Many other reviewers praised the volume, as David did in our summer edition. While arousing fits of jealousy among those whom Patrick Kavanagh called the standing army of Irish poets for having snagged Faber, an imprint already boasting Eliot, Auden, McNeice, Spender, and Ted Hughes, Heaney entered the scene with aplomb and assurance. The title poem describes the revulsion and terror felt by a young boy experiencing the grosser aspects of nature for the first time, hence his symbolic death. But in the scope of late 20th century writing, this seeming rejection of nature was misleading, for one of the strongest qualities of Heaney's work as a whole is its engagement with nature in many moods. This makes him unusual in the literature of the time, which affected a world-weary urban sophistication in the style of T.S. Eliot, a refusal to be transported or blessed by nature's presences in a Wordsworthian way. Modern literature is more likely to take, in the words of Samuel Beckett, the shine off our bliss. Heaney does not shirk the bleak, cruel side of nature, but he celebrates its mysterious and awe-inspiring otherness as well. More than Wordsworth, he approaches Gerard Manley Hopkins in his evocations of visceral physical sensations. Indeed, few modern poets have evoked so powerfully the feel, the look, and the sound of things with such seemingly insouciant accuracy. Impressive as this first volume was, a more assured start, for example, than the young Yeats. It took Heaney a decade or so to deepen his themes: the mystery of nature, violence in nature and human nature, country crafts and occupations, childhood presences, Irish and other mythologies. These themes were expanded by being juxtaposed and looped and lapped with the poet's wide and intelligent reading. He is a very allusive writer in his prose as well as his verse. Sometimes the echoes are so subtle that they go initially unnoticed. On top of this, Heaney gave the impression from the first of having embarked on an epic journey, what Jung calls an opus, a lifelong self-discovery. The first stages are involved with the transition from craft to art and the discovery of technique, that magic moment when both poet and reader know that the empty buckets sent clattering into the abandoned wells of the mind are suddenly coming up with a heft of fullness. Like his great Irish predecessor, Yeats, Heaney consolidated his reputation with each successive volume, and each volume was designed carefully to be more than the sum of its parts. The soil of his work becomes layered with a compost of meanings. Soon the poems become self-referencing as well as world-referencing, quote, an ingredient in their own fodder, unquote, to quote one of his critics. Again, like Yeats, it wasn't long before this personal epic quest became coterminous with a quest for national self-identity. It is hard to overemphasize the presence, indeed the shadow of Yeats, for us young Irish writers. By the mid-60s, Yeats had been dead only 25 years. His achievement and his influence were daunting. The Yeats International Summer School opened in Sligo in 1960 and was, and still is, a magnet for good scholarship and conviviality. It was all too easy to write with a Yeatsian flavor, intonation, and rhythm. Another remarkable facet of Heaney's first volume was its seeming immunity to the Yeatsian timbre. Yet Heaney, like everyone else, had to absorb this powerful, omnipresent, and eccentric predecessor. Many of our friendships were formed under the Yeatsian banner. We signed off to each other with greetings such as, "From your brother in Yeats." Influential critics, including Cyril Connolly in the UK and Richard Ellman in the States, were positioning Yeats as a high priest of modernism, along with Joyce in the novel. In Connolly's terminology in his book Enemies of Promise, they were mandarins as opposed to the vernacular such as Hemingway and Orwell. So the early 20th century Irish achievement looked definitive for a long time to come. When Yeats died in January 1939, Auden wrote In Memory of W.B. Yeats, in which appears the line, "Let the Irish vessel lie empty of its poetry." Stretching a point, one could say that the Irish vessel was without its great poet for only 3 months of the 20th century, as Heaney, with his customary sense of timing, was born in April 1939. The decade of the 1960s was a peculiarly propitious one for poetry. For students, writing poetry was as natural as listening to Beatles songs, many of which, especially George Harrison's, had impressive and haunting lyrics. "Here comes the sun" was our watchword and passionate cry. In fact, the gap between extremes of cultural expression, high and pop, was considerably narrowed in that decade, always a healthy sign. Irish schools, both in the North and in the Republic, provided a broad exposure to literature, including many English classics. Heaney is quick to acknowledge his educational debt to Britain. As a scholarship boy from a farm, he was a beneficiary of the 1944 Education Act in Britain. The curriculum for Heaney's English degree at Queen's University in Belfast would have been similar to the one I studied at Trinity College Dublin, both heavily influenced by an Oxford-Cambridge range and stringency. In major universities of the 1960s, as Camille Paglia points out, professors specializing in poetry criticism had stratospheric reputations. Great works in verse and prose were taught with analytical rigor, but with respect for their entities as works of art. Many professors were resonant readers and reciters, and a seemingly effortless learning of things by heart was the encouraged norm. We took note of the heroic resistance of Russian poets, Anna Akhmatova, Pasternak, and the young Yevtushenko, who wrote in his precocious autobiography, 1963, "Russian poets have always been the spiritual government of their country." We emulated Keats when he describes in a letter his excitement at assimilating all kinds of experience in art and life, the reed's trellis of a working brain. The enchanted looms of our brains were working at full tilt. The overall trajectory of a successful career in any field is a fascinating process. It often strikes me, studying the emergence of figures that come to be called great, as akin to a horse race. Art, I know, is not a race, but artists are often very territorial, or at any rate hyper-aware of possible rivals, both alive and dead. And I know that from spending the 1960s in Dublin, which, as Van Boland has written, is a very abrasive atmosphere. The analogy, as far as it goes, works like this. At the beginning of a career, many contemporary practitioners are jostling together, biding their time, getting into the right rhythm and pace to sustain them for the long haul, and keeping a keen eye on advantages such as an inside position for corners and so on. Ireland in the 60s saw many writers emerge from the starting gates, jockeying for position and keeping their options open. At this stage, the first lap or so, only the most perceptive onlooker notices the dark horse, the one that 2 laps later suddenly gathers speed and strides away from the field. Heaney began to leave his Irish contemporaries behind by the mid-70s and kept up the sure-footed pace thereafter. The following essay is an attempt to evaluate Heaney's importance by setting him in the context of his Irish background, his international reputation, and his overall achievement, which bids fair to be of permanent significance. I argue that one of the keys to Heaney's unusual accessibility arises from his conjuring trick of being both personal and impersonal, both local and universal, of being able to move seamlessly from the kitchen sink to the cosmos. Heaney tells us in the essay Feeling into Words that he had begun dabbling in verses in 1962. By the mid-60s, his published poems were competent and well-made, but not more so than other poets emerging at the time. He had written Digging in 1964, but it didn't appear until Death of a Naturalist. For example, in the spring 1965 edition of the Dublin magazine, Rivers, Carew, and myself published 2 Heaney poems. One of them, Docker, revealed a nervousness about Northern Irish politics that unfortunately proved by 1970 to be prescient. That fist would drop a hammer on a Catholic. Oh yes, that kind of thing could start again. The only Roman collar he tolerates smiles all around his sleek pint of porter. Now there's a very, that's a Heaney trademark, the almost mundane image there of this hardline orange man sitting in a pub, grunting away, and porter, as you know, has a foam at the top, and in the old days you could always recognize a Roman Catholic priest by his dog collar, as it was called. So it's a relaxed style, but it always has a sense of menace. I vividly remember that poem, coming in the hopeful 1960s. The conversational tone and the homely image strike a characteristic mood, but we also published accomplished season poems by Michael Longley, Derek Mahan, Brendan Kennelly, John Montague, and Van Boland, who looked at the time to be the coming leaders of the pack. In the spring of 1966, during which the 50th anniversary celebrations of the Easter Rising, 1916, were widely celebrated in the Republic, Heaney sent us 2 more poems. One of them, Requiem for the Croppies, was his own characteristic, low-key, seemingly unengaged tribute to the Rising of 1916 by harking back to the rebellion of 1798, when scantily armed country lads, known as the Croppies because of their French-style hair, faced the might of the Redcoats. We published this poem in the summer issue of the Dublin magazine, which appeared shortly after Faber had published Death of a Naturalist. The Lament for the Croppies was reprinted in Heaney's second collection, Door into the Dark, 1969. In a review of a collection by John Heath Stubbs in our summer issue, Heaney wrote of Heath Stubbs' poems falling short of maturity. He described the poems as those of a man, quote, treading water before entering the deep end. In the poem Lamenting the Croppies, readers felt that Heaney was not only very much afloat, but was beginning to be carried out to unknown waters by a powerful current. Again, the homely image of the barley in the pockets only enhances the sense that Heaney is entering deep waters indeed. The pockets of our greatcoats full of barley, no kitchens on the run, no striking camp. We moved quick and sudden in our own country. The priests lay behind ditches with the tramp. A people hardly marching on the hike. We found new tactics happening each day. Horseman and horse fell to the 12-foot pike. We'd stampede cattle into infantry. Retreat through hedges where cavalry must be thrown until, on Vinegar Hill, the fatal conclave. Terraced thousands died, shaking sides at cannon. The hillside blushed, soaked in our broken wave. They buried us without shroud or coffin, and in August, barley grew up out of the grave. Modern Irish poets have had an abiding fascination with the sonnet, and Heaney himself went on to master this form, so much so that Requiem for the Croppies now looks like juvenilia. And I should also mention that it is rather overtly political, which Heaney tended to tone down later in his career. In fact, during the height of the Troubles in the 70s, Heaney refused to read this poem because in case it was too southern nationalistic, he never wanted to overtly take sides. But already Heaney is doing more than treading water. Irish sonnets both celebrate and subvert the form. Irish writers in English since Swift have in all genres subtly shaped and implicitly dismantled the mainstream framework. These writers don't have to strain after irony and black humor. Their historical situation gives them irony aplenty. For example, it was during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, the great age of the English sonnet, that the first systematic attempt to subdue the powerful Irish chieftains took place. The rebellion of 1798 was one in a series of resistances to colonial power. By 1600, the Anglo-Norman settlers from the 12th century on had been assimilated. They had become, in the famous phrase, more Irish than the Irish themselves. But the new Puritan, Presbyterian, and Cromwellian settlers were post-Reformation Protestants, a crucial difference. To this day, that religious divide is evident in Ireland, especially in the north. The tension and violence resulting is one of Heaney's great themes. I'd say the Irish are snobs about longevity of family because, for example, my mother used to employ someone from Howth village in County Dublin, and the local gentry family in Howth Castle was called Gaisford St. Lawrence, and they were Normans, had been there since 1200. That's pretty good. But then the woman who cooked for us was called Bessie Hartford, and she used to boast that she was a Viking, so that the Normans were newcomers. The Croppy poem speaks in a quiet voice as one of the victims, a voice likely to be overlooked by conventional history. Heaney here begins to show his uncanny ability to speak in tongues, to give voice to what otherwise would be lost. His great contemporary, the former Irish President Mary Robinson, has recently published her autobiography, the subtitle of which is My Life-Giving Voice. These two modern Irish icons share a similar sense of purpose, of indignation at pettiness, displaying a brilliant confrontation with the sinister powers abroad in contemporary life. Both gained strength from their traditional rural and Catholic upbringing, while transcending all parishes of the mind into a universal sense of justice. Their careers are both dedicated to giving others a voice. When Robinson left her distinguished tenure as United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in 2002, she chose to read Heaney's poem From the Republic of Conscience as her last official words in office. The poem concludes, "Their embassies," he said, "were everywhere, but operated independently, and no ambassador would ever be relieved." Robinson comments in her memoir, "I reminded myself, Mary Robinson, private citizen of tomorrow, that no ambassador would ever be relieved." Both figures are aware that the grammar and syntax of justice require a life sentence. For the rest of this talk, I want to put Heaney's achievement in perspective by using the framework of a concept conceived by the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor. In his book, The Malaise of Modernity, which was originally a CBC series of talks, Taylor discusses what true authenticity means to him, as opposed to the many narcissistic attempts in our era to be true to one's own experience. He introduces the concept of horizons of significance. Things take on importance against a background of intelligibility. Let us call this a horizon. It follows that one of the things we can't do if we are to define ourselves significantly is suppress or deny the horizons against which things take on significance for us. This is the kind of self-defeating move frequently being carried out in our subjectivist civilizations. Horizons are given. I can define my identity only against the background of things that matter. But to bracket out history, nature, society, the demands of solidarity, everything but what I find in myself, would be to eliminate all candidates for what matters. One of the reasons for Heaney's eminence, in my view, is that he incorporates several powerful horizons pertinent to his own life, the Irish identity, and the dilemmas of postmodern humans in general. I would like to discuss the following horizons as they apply to his work. 1, Catholicism. 2, history. 3, nature. 4, literary traditions and the world of learning. And 5, family. Many people in our era have reacted against the constraints of these horizons. It seems many people believe that to reject anything that puts a limit on their self-definition is enough to be authentic. But Heaney had to confront some very sensitive and painful areas of his background in order to arrive at true poetic expression. Let us start with Catholicism, the religion of his parents and ancestors. Old-fashioned Irish Catholicism has indeed much that is repugnant to our contemporary sensibilities, especially after the revelations of violence and abuse that emerged especially throughout the 1990s and beyond, causing almost a dissolution of the traditional faith. Mary Robinson remembers that after she had defended women's rights and contraception in her early days as a Trinity senator in the government, by the way, I don't know if you remember, but in the old-style republic, you couldn't even publicly buy condoms and so on. You had to take the train to Belfast. There was a famous incident where a group of women came back on the train from Belfast, waving out the window. Anyway, she was denounced from the pulpit of her parents' church in County Galway. Heaney, in his poem *The Settlebed*, sums up the dilemma for an aware citizen. Whatever is given can always be reimagined, however four-square, plank-thick, hull-stupid, and out of its time it happens to be. Those are wonderful adjectives. The variant of, he's as thick as two planks and so on. Plank thick, hull stupid is wonderful. Is this not the task of a major poet? To absorb what Keats called the disagreeables of life, the abattoir of history, the smothering closeness of the family, the cruelties of nature, the absurdities of institutions, the flaws in all traditional arrangements, including literary canons, and to reimagine them so that there might emerge an escape route of renovation, hope, reconciliation, or comfort. This, I believe, is what Heaney's poems achieve. By confronting these dark holes, he has to undertake a personal descent into the underworld, a punishing self-critique to emerge the stronger and able to reflect the daily tragedies of his society in a dark time. My wife and I were in Ireland when Heaney died in August 2013. We watched his funeral on television. The service took place in the local Catholic church of Heaney's parish, Sandymount, a seaside suburb of Dublin. His house looks over Sandymount Strand and the open sea, with the peninsula of Howth in the distance. Stephen Dedalus, you remember, walked into eternity on Sandymount Strand. Yeats's paternal ancestors once owned Sandymount Castle. Yeats himself was born in the suburb. It seemed entirely appropriate that the lamented poet should be welcomed back into what Newman calls the everlasting arms of Mother Church, and the proceedings were dignified and inspiring. To grow up in Ireland up to about 30 years ago, whichever foot you dug with, as we used to say, was to be guaranteed womb-to-tomb membership of an exclusive religious club, along with the constraints and sanctions that came with the territory. This was especially true of the old-fashioned Irish Catholic Church. The absurdities, such as heavy censorship of quite innocuous movies and books, and the demonization of Trinity College Dublin, for example, were usually ignored or ridiculed because the sense of belonging was a good trade-off. But as affluence increased from the 1960s on, and spectacularly in the 1990s, when Ireland was probably the richest country in Europe, the rearguard attitudes began to look drab at best and toxic at worst, as revelations of abusive clerics were everyday reading. It is against this background, this horizon of revulsion, that Heaney's work maintains a dignified spiritual consistency, agnostic but respectful. And this gave many readers much comfort and reassurance. Joyce, as you remember, was brought up and received his rigorous education within the Jesuit branch of this old tradition. he famously rejected the trio of faith, fatherland, and family, and shook the dust of Dublin from his restless feet, living abroad for the rest of his life. But the language and iconography of Catholicism stays with him. The Irish short story writer Sean O'Whalon once wrote that there is no detergent known to humankind that can erase the stain of an Irish Catholic upbringing. But Joyce converts the life-stifling aspects into a more dynamic stance. The artist, for example, becomes a priest of the internal imagination, and concepts such as transubstantiation are converted into artistic processes. Similarly, Heaney can use unself-consciously the language of religion in new ways. In one of his most accomplished poems, St. Kevin and the Blackbird, he brings to life the legend of St. Kevin of Glendalough, who allowed a bird to hatch in his outstretched hand. Kevin, finding himself linked into the network of eternal life, is moved to pity. It's a very moving legend. He has his hand out the window, and then a bird alights on it, and so he keeps his hand there for several weeks. Far from being a nostalgic account of the good old days of Celtic spirituality, the poem becomes a moving parable for our times, reaffirming the central truth that patience, compassion, and the virtue of caritas are perennially relevant. Alone and mirrored clear in love's deep river, to labor and not to seek reward, he prays. A prayer his body makes entirely, for he has forgotten self, forgotten bird, and on the river bank, forgotten the river's name. Moving on to the horizon of history, it is a truism that history is omnipresent in Ireland. One might say that there is too much history and not enough geography, impelling millions of people to throw off what feels like the heavy rain-sodden overcoat of the past and stand tall in some foreign clime. I'm an immigrant myself, and I can attest to that. In a way, coming to North America is a kind of relief. It's like a heavy overcoat. But Heaney, in his own words, is an inner emigre. Like Yeats, he chose to stay put and face the music of what happens, much of which is discordant. Our island is full of comfortless noises. I'm sure you pick up an echo there of "Be not afeard, the isle is full of noises," from The Tempest. Our pioneers strike downwards, he writes in Bogland, and his whole oeuvre is a spadework piercing of the shifting earth of his country to see what he can dig up. This ranges from the murderous to the marvelous, from sacrificial victims preserved in the peat to priceless golden artifacts whose tags in the National Museum read, "Found in a bog." Conor Cruise O'Brien once wrote that an Irish writer is one involved in the Irish situation and usually mauled by it. In my experience, this is true. In a relentless seesaw, one thing cancels out another, so that achieving anything, especially in the arts, is difficult. The constantly shifting yin-yang of Anglo-Irish relationships keeps writers on their toes. For all its abrasiveness, Dublin literary and social life is full of wit, irony, and brisk interchange. One of the dangers of Heaney's relocation to the Republic in 1972 that is, Heaney in 1972 came south and rented a cottage from Professor Anne Saddlemeyer, who lives in Victoria, as you know. And then the Heaneys eventually bought Glanmore Cottage, which was on the Singh estate from Anne Saddlemeyer. One of the dangers of Heaney's relocation to the Republic in 1972 is that Southerners bandy words about like spendthrifts, as opposed to the tight-lipped Northerners Heaney was used to. He remained affable, but never succumbed to that convivial pub life which has seen countless potential great Irish novels sputter out in the foam of pints of Guinness. He got on with the nurturing of what was emerging by the 1980s as an uncanny talent, responsive to the invisible ripples of the psychic forces in his environment. Then I landed in the head school of Glanmore, and from the backs of ditches hoped to raise a voice caught back off slughorn and slow chanter that might continue, hold, dispel, appease. Vowels ploughed into each other, opened ground, each verse returning like the plough turned round. That brings us to the horizon of nature. One of the impressive aspects of Heaney's achievement is that he is really at heart a lyric pastoral poet in an era and in a political climate at odds with such a stance, even though that stance is itself skeptical of the pastoral mode. Pastoral poetry is written, as you know, by educated poets hankering after the simplicity of shepherds. Heaney has the double perspective of a highly educated man who grew up in the world of bare earth floors, candlelight, and farmers slapping the rumps of cattle. In the quotation you have just heard, for example, Heaney pinpoints the fact that the Latin word verses meant a line of poetry, but also the turn of horse and ploughboy at the end of a furrow. He is a truly cultivated man, knowing the lore of cultivating the earth and of cultivating the mind, being always alert to the rich associations of etymology. Heaney's ability to convey what we might call the phenomenology of experience and to convey the uncanny presence of even the most humble objects, a school satchel, or a pitchfork, or indeed a fountain pen, with an almost Johnsonian common sense, is allied to a feeling for the numinous. In the volume, Seeing Things, he is standing in front of a cathedral. All afternoon, heat wavered on the steps, and the air we stood up to our eyes in wavered like the zigzag hieroglyph for life itself. Or he finds himself contemplating a remote harbor. Deserted harbor stillness, every stone clarified and dormant underwater, the harbor wall a masonry of silence. Fullness, shimmer. Laden high Atlantic the moorings barely stirred in, very slight plucking of the swell against boat boards. Perfected vision, cockle minarets consigned down there with green slicked bottle glass, shell debris and a reddened bud of sandstone. Air and ocean known as antecedents of each other, in apposition with omnipresence, equilibrium, brim. Here the spiritual, metaphysical word omnipresence is held in delicate balance with the sheer physicality of the brimming water. After the syncopations of the Latinate words, antecedents, apposition, omnipresence, equilibrium, we are brought back to reality by the abrupt Middle English word brim. His dressings and undressings are as deft as Milton's. And that brings us to another given for a serious poet. The horizon of distinguished literature in English, with its traditional infusion of raw energy from across the Irish Sea, and now from all former colonies. A London critic notes his delight in this phenomenon when he attended a recent Irish play, when one of the characters turns to his companion and says, "Pour me a fitting measure of our Lord's tears," meaning a double whiskey. Mention has already been made of the Irish take on the sonnet. Irish writers inherit a complex interplay of syntax and vocabulary from the clash between standard English and the English spoken and written in Ireland, also known as Hiberno English. Just to remind you that in 1800, which isn't that long ago, well, 200 years ago, Ireland was 95% Gaelic speaking. 1900, it was 3/4 English speaking, and it's 95%, well, universally English speaking now, but about 20% of people can speak Gaelic as well. Heaney is a learned and elusive writer. He is not afraid to sprinkle his verse and his prose with snippets of wisdom culled from his extensive and deep reading. To get away with this, the original needs to be thoroughly absorbed, so that quoting it is like a work of translation, adding to the new work, but also illuminating the antecedent one. He is, in this respect, emulating the belief and practice of Osip Mandelstam, who wrote, "A quotation is a cicada, a small voice singing in the grass of its host text." In one of his most beautiful elegies, in a recent volume, Human Chain, Heaney remembers the folk singer David Hammond. The language has the Heaney trademarks of stark simplicity, the reminting of cliches in a new context, and for an alert reader, a number of echoes of other literature. Here is the elegy. The door was open and the house was dark, wherefore I called his name. Although I knew the answer this time would be silence that kept me standing listening while it grew backwards and down and out into the street, where as I entered, I remember now, the street lamps too were out. I felt for the first time there and then a stranger, intruder almost, wanting to take flight, yet well aware that here there was no danger, only withdrawal, a not unwelcoming emptiness, as in a midnight hangar on an overgrown airfield in late summer. Heaney once wrote an analysis of a poem by Thomas Hardy. The only comment he could make after one particularly beautiful image was, "My God," says the reader. Every time I read that bleak simile at the end of this poem, I mutter, "My God." The cliches of the phrases down and out and there and then are giving surprising new context, and the whole poem is a 13-line, sawn-off would-be sonnet, enhancing the feeling of bleakness. In the Petrarchan tradition of the sonnet, frustration is often a major theme, usually unrequited love. Here, frustration is cosmic in extent. There is a giant absence in the universe. Humans, by confronting it, somehow find a not unwelcoming emptiness. As far as the literary allusions go, for me there is a strong echo of Tennyson's In Memoriam, especially the segment starting, dark house by which once more I stand, here in the long, unlovely street. Doors where my heart was used to beat so quickly, waiting for a hand. Then Heaney's two mentions of the word out reflects Frost's poem Out, Out, an elegy for a young boy, which of course in turn echoes Macbeth's Out, Out, brief candle. There is also a generic echoing of the mood in many of Thomas Hardy's poems, one of loneliness, rejection, almost I told you so feeling. Isn't that what life is? And from what dark corner of the mind does he dredge up that midnight hangar? As the elderly poet recreates the antennae of the young boy he was in the 1940s, noticing the details of a world resembling a scene from Foyle's War or The Land Girls. Just to remind you that I grew up in the Republic, which fortunately for us was neutral in the Second World War, but of course the north of Ireland was part of Britain. And so, for example, in the preparations for D-Day, the north would have been full of American soldiers and British soldiers marshalling for the great event. And yet, and here's the mystery of what Heaney calls the necessary poetry, that which has weight because it is imagined within the gravitational pull of the actual. There is deep contentment, a closure, a sense of rightness, even though there is wrongness all around it. This poem and many others by Heaney have given his work a depth and moral alertness that we look for in a major writer. He thought long and hard about the role and the responsibilities of the poet, about what he called poetic authority. He defines this as the rights and weight which accrue to a voice not only because of a sustained history of truth-telling, but by virtue also of its tonality, the sway it gains over the deep ear, and through that over other parts of our mind and nature. We expect truth from a poet. It is typical of Heaney that he believes that truth is all the more authentic for being couched in memorable lyrical modes. T.S. Eliot, a very different poet, had written something similar in his belief that a major poet has what he called auditory imagination, which for him penetrates far below the conscious levels of thought and feeling and fuses the most ancient and the most civilized mentality. As another American poet, Mary Oliver, puts it, emotion does not elicit feeling, style elicits feeling. In other words, the poets we tend to remember have perfect verbal pitch, just as top musicians have perfect pitch. And like Heaney, they combine the primitive with the sophisticated. In the light of this ethically depth-charged inner ear, who are his master voices? The most obvious and persistent presences in his work are first, from the past, Virgil, Dante, Shakespeare, George Herbert, Wordsworth, Hardy, Hopkins, Yeats, and T.S. Eliot. From his contemporaries, we have Philip Larkin, Milosz, Lowell, Elizabeth Bishop, East European poets in general, the heroic Russians such as Anna Akhmatova, and his Northern Irish co-workers such as Michael Longley and Derek Mahan. Most of all is his close friend and eminent poetic rival, Ted Hughes, who in a letter movingly describes Heaney's gift as making it, quote, easier for people to love each other. The work of these poets and many more is absorbed deeply, contributing cicada-like to the overall sonic and existential tone of his work. To paraphrase Hamlet, his practice looks before and after, and does not leave material to fust in him unused. Finally, There is the horizon of family background and local associations. I know it's past the hour now, but we did, in fact, not start until 10 past. This is just an hour. Heaney's mother and father, his wife, and his children are all featured in his poetry, and often evince the best of him. His father's influence seems especially dominant. A strong, silent farmer with little patience for indulgence of any kind. His father put him on a stringent path of self-discipline, humility, and generally keeping his head below the parapet, a necessity for the Catholic minority in an aggressively Protestant, orange-oriented state. Out of many choices in poems to his father, here is one succinct testimony to his influence. The dotted line my father's ash plant made on Sandymouth Strand is something else the tide won't wash away. As for Heaney's mother, she inspired the sonnet sequence Clearances from the Hall Lantern, 1987, perhaps for readers the most endearing part of all his work. In fact, in a recent survey run by the Irish Times, asking Irish readers to name their all-time favourite Irish poem, the second sonnet in Clearances was an outright winner. I think it deserves its place in people's affections. Here it is. When all the others were away at Mass, I was all hers as we peeled potatoes. They broke the silence, let fall one by one like solder weeping off the soldering iron. Cold comforts set between us, things to share gleaming in a bucket of clean water, and again let fall. Little pleasant splashes from each other's work would bring us to our senses. So, while the parish priest at our bedside went hammer and tongs at the prayers for the dying, and some were responding and some crying, I remembered her head bent towards my head, her breath in mine, our fluent, dipping knives, never closer the whole rest of our lives. This is an example of Heaney's mastery of the sonnet, but was there ever a more relaxed one? It combines the Shakespearean form ending in a rhyming couplet and the Petrarchan form comprising two parts, one the octave and one the sestet. The volta or turn begins with the, for Heaney, loaded word so, and you remember he famously opens his translation of Beowulf with so, which kind of cancels out the past. And now, okay, come on, forward. Once again, there is an example of a cliche, hammer and tongs, used in a surprising context. There is the easy mingling of domestic life and spiritual life. There is honesty, and above all, there is intimacy. This is a quality not often talked about in the analysis of literature, but intimacy and tenderness are hallmarks of mature work, which links the individual with what Emerson called the horizon line of truth. It links the microcosm with the macrocosm. If this sounds what a Northern Irish person might call too highfalutin, what about Heaney's habit of finding the generic truth in a local instance? Heaney's early poems about local crafts, diviner, thatcher, the forge, and so on, are all metaphors for the poetic power of finding analogy and correspondence, for the boldness of the imagination to break molds of every kind. In Coleridge's words, this habit dissolves, diffuses, dissipates in order to recreate. Heaney's work divines hidden energies, thatches and binds together strands of thought, forges new connections, digs into psychic soil, and plows the field of the mind one furrow, one line at a time. It epitomizes what Charles Taylor sees as a cure for our loss of a sense of belonging through a publicly defined order. This loss needs to be compensated by a stronger, more inner sense of linkage. This is what a great deal of modern poetry has been trying to articulate. and perhaps we need few things more today than such articulation. So let us return to that very Irish scene, a country race course, and remember the metaphor I used, the pleasure derived from seeing that dark horse surging ahead, that sure-footed positioning, that perfectly coordinated stride, that sheer physical embodiment of sleek performative energy. My money is still on that one. Let us call him Mossbone Lad, as he now enters another dimension after his earthly endeavors. I believe his posthumous reputation will stay intact, indeed will increase in stature, that Heaney's work is a keeper, and that the late 20th century and beyond will be seen by poetry critics as revolving around famous Seamus, just as the early 20th century was the eminent domain of his great compatriot W.B. The Wild Swans at Cool, you remember, ends with a question. By what rushes will they build? By what lake's edge or pool delight men's eyes when I awake some day to find they have flown away? But the earthed lightning of the swan's inspiration has not gone far. Geographically, into the next county, and figuratively, into another great imagination. This is a poem called Postscript, and it's one with which I will conclude the talk. And sometime make the time to drive out west into County Clare along the flaggy shore in September or October, when the wind and the light are working off each other so that the ocean on one side is wild with foam and litter. And inland among stones, the surface of a slate-grey lake is lit by the earthed lightning of a flock of swans, their feathered ruffed and ruffling, white on white, their fully grown, headstrong-looking heads tucked or cresting or busy underwater. Useless to think you'll park and capture it more thoroughly. You are neither here nor there. A hurry through which strange things pass, as big soft buffetings come at the car sideways and catch the heart off guard and blow it open. Thank you.